Hi, I'm Omkar. I'm the founder of Cerebranium. We are a learning analytics company headquartered in Berlin, Germany. And we've started this podcast with the theme of learning to learn, where we are speaking to domain experts, to innovators in the education space who are helping rebuild education from the ground up after the COVID pandemic. And with us today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Stephen Kosslyn. And Dr. Stephen Kosslyn has had a deep background in learning science, in psychology, and has been on the panels of several prestigious institutions like Harvard and Stanford. So I'll let Stephen, if I may, introduce himself on the podcast. And then we'll jump straight into a few topics around learning, basically around learning outcomes, around how learning outcomes and understanding them can be valuable, and how transparency in the education space today can be helpful to all stakeholders of the system, including students, instructors, teachers, and the entire educational organization. So, Stephen, over to you. Would love to hear a bit of your background and what you're doing now in the education space.
Okay, thanks. And thank you for having me on this. I really appreciate the opportunity. So my background is fairly academic. For 3 decades, I was on the Harvard faculty. I was chair of psychology department and dean of social sciences. Also was co-director of the Mind and Market Lab at Harvard Business School. And I had an appointment in the neurology department at Mass General Hospital. I left there to go to Stanford, where I'd been a graduate student, and ran the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences for a couple of years, and was a professor in the psychology department there. It was not a great fit for me. So when I was approached by Ben Nelson, who had just raised a substantial amount of money to start a new university, when I was approached by him to be the founding dean and chief academic officer, sort of build Minerva, I found it extremely attractive. So I left Stanford and spent 5.5 years at Minerva, helping to develop the curriculum and all the academic parts. Then left there to sort of do the anti-Minerva, Foundry College. Minerva is extremely elite. They take less than 2% of the applications. Foundry was intended to teach skills and knowledge that would not be easily automated, teach it to working adults. So it's a very different approach, which was extremely interesting. It's still going strong. In the meantime, I've spun off another company called Active Learning Sciences, which essentially harvests what I learned both from the academic work and then at Minerva and Foundry about how to use the science of learning to good effect, how to train instructors so they can be more effective and help students learn and actually have fun while doing so.
Absolutely. And I think just so many accolades and so many, so many years of experience in this domain must have shown you so many things, must have helped you sort of gather so much information, so much knowledge about what is actually effective and what is not. I think the first sort of question that comes to my mind on the topic is, what is the secret sauce when it comes to making learning fun? If there was one sort of recipe that is maybe not missing, but is hard to find today, what would that be?
In a word, engagement. You got to set it up so that it's immediately obvious why it's relevant to something the learner cares about. And you've got to set it up so that it's not so easy as to be boring and not so challenging as to be frustrating. So you want that Goldilocks spot. You want them at the Goldilocks spot of challenge and difficulty, seeing why it's relevant and engaging so that it's something interesting to them as well.
Right. And I think engagement is a word that, is being talked about more and more as we speak within the domain. And of course, modern edtech companies, as well as more traditional, let's say, organizations and institutions. Often there are several interpretations of engagement. Many colleges interpret engagement as attendance in lectures, for example. Or many people interpret engagement as perhaps how much time learners are spending on the learning content. Or is the content engaging, for example? So how do you see engagement in the whole grand scheme of things?
Right. I put it in the context of active learning, which some people have described as learning by doing, which I don't think is a great way of looking at it. You can do things to no end, no particular goal, just exploratory and not really learn much of anything in the process. I think it's more useful to think about learning by using. That is, they have some information. There's a learning objective, some reason for them to have been given that information, and then they're going to use it in some way. There's some task that's been structured. It might be problem solving, it might be role playing, it might be a debate, it can be lots of different kinds of things, but they're using the information in the service of trying to achieve that learning objective. So from the point of view of active learning, what engagement is setting them up so they'll pay attention and think deeply about the content they're being given, and then actually use it, actually be engaged, actually be involved in producing something, using the information to some end. So in some ways it taps into motivation, actually, and of course there's a lot known about motivation.
Indeed. And would you say engagement and motivation are different but related things? Like motivation drives engagement, or does engagement increase motivation?
So some of both, actually. I think it's useful to distinguish between two big categories of motivation. There's intrinsic and extrinsic. So intrinsic motivation, there's a lot of literature on this. The three big factors are feelings of competence, so which implies, again, this idea of finding the Goldilocks spot. You don't want them challenged so much they can't do it. You want a sense of autonomy, where there's some choice involved. They feel like they're not being forced to do something, that they're doing it because they want to. And then the last thing is social engagement. Having people involved with others during particularly active learning is hugely important, because they want to help each other and they want to let each other down. So those are all intrinsic. We're kind of born with those motivations. They're very cross-cultural. Extrinsic motivation is stuff that a lot of behavioral psychologists have studied, in particular with incentives and consequences. So at the very beginning of one of these episodes, learning episodes that I call learning sandwich, we'll talk about later, where you're giving content, you want to make sure that students know why the content's important, and why in terms of a broader relevance, why it's relevant to their lives and goals and so on, but also that they're going to be needing to use it in an activity that's going to follow. So that if they don't pay attention, so there's an incentive, there are going to be consequences. They're going to have trouble doing this thing, and they'll let other people down, so we hook into the intrinsic part. So the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation should work together, and both of them should be in the service of helping the students focus, pay attention, and use information in some kind of application. It's so that they in fact will learn what you've set out as an instructor to define as a learning objective.
And what would you say is an example of an extrinsic, let's say, motivational factor? Often in many traditional education programs, it can often be a bit of fear, perhaps. Like fear can be an extrinsic motivator. Fear of, let's say, being cast out from, let's say, a group, or fear of not making it to some sort of an elite club of jobs or companies or higher education colleges. Are there any other let's say, more healthy or more positive, extrinsic motivators that can be at play here?
Yeah. So you can think about extrinsic motivation in terms of reinforcement, which leads you to be more likely to do something you just did in the future if you're reinforced for it, and punishment, which not so effective, but it tends to make you less likely to do it in the future. Now, there's two kinds of reinforcement, positive and negative. They're both reinforcing. They both make you more likely to do the thing in the future, not punishment. So what you're just describing with fear, when fear is removed, that's called negative reinforcement. So when you take something negative and you get rid of it, that makes you more likely to do whatever it was that got rid of it. Positive reinforcement is where something good, something you want, is a consequence of doing something. It might be a good grade. That's the most obvious kind of extrinsic motivator. That's but both kinds of reinforcement, positive and negative, lead you to do whatever it is that led to the reinforcement, lead you to do that more likely to do it in the future. So negative reinforcement, a lot of people confuse that with punishment, which is where something bad happens to you as a consequence. It's not. It's when you remove something that was aversive, fear in this case, you get rid of it. That's very reinforcing.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I would admit that, for me as well, that's how I thought about it, but it makes a lot more sense the way you put it right now, that the absence of something is negative, I believe. And going forward from there, like, and we're seeing that there is a difference, or rather, there is motivation and engagement are two separate things. They feed each other. So is it more of a chicken and egg problem? Like, what comes first? What do you start with?
Oh, I think you have to start motivation first. I mean, nothing's going to happen unless they pay attention. Unless learners pay attention and think it through, what the content is that you're giving them, they're not going to be in a position to do anything with that information because they won't have absorbed it. So you need to set up a situation where learners are motivated to pay attention, take it in, and then so there's a kind of engagement there. The motivation leads to paying attention, which is a kind of engagement. But a deeper kind of engagement is really doing something with it, using it in some way. So doing something in the service of a goal. There's a focus that's involved. And that kind of engagement is what really leads it to stick.
I see. So having a student engaged enough so that they are able to take what they have learned, and internalized, and sort of externally perhaps apply it in the form of an activity, or in the form of, let's say, some sort of a practical output, ideally in a group, like we said, can maximize the quality of the learning outcomes that the program is achieving.
Right. So I have organized those kind of ideas into this idea of a learning sandwich, which I alluded to earlier, where there's two kinds. And in a front-loaded one, you give some content that's relevant to a learning objective for maybe 10, 12 minutes. It's a lecture. It can be punctuated with polls and asking questions and so on to encourage engagement. But you also want to tell them why you're telling them this in terms of why it's relevant, capital R, to their lives writ large, but also they're going to need it for an upcoming activity. That's the first part. And then in the middle, there's the activity itself, which is designed to use that initial information in a way that they'll understand how to apply it. It'll reinforce this idea of relevance. And then the last part is a debrief, where typically in that middle part, they produce some kind of work product. So you don't necessarily want to grade those every time, but you want to give feedback on them. So there are various ways of using peer feedback with rubrics. So there are clear criteria that they're using to give each other feedback that you can use part of the debrief, but also you want to have a representative sample present to the group as a whole and for the instructor to give some feedback. So that's front-loaded. Another way to do this learning sandwich idea is back-loaded, where do you know Eric Mazur's peer instruction technique? You come across that?
No, I do not actually. Would be lovely if you can, introduce us the summary of it.
It's a really good example of what I mean. So what he does it in a lecture hall. So he'll have the students cluster up in little groups of 3 or 4 and give them a puzzle. So, for example, if he's teaching kinetics, he's a physicist. Um, he might say, "Okay, here's a puzzle. Here's a meter by meter sheet of iron, and we're going to cut out a disc that's maybe 10 centimeters across in the middle. So out it comes, and that's now a hole, round hole right in the middle of it. And now we're going to heat the entire thing up so it's red hot. It's not melting, but it's really hot. And here's the question. Does that hole, the diameter of that hole, get larger after the sheet has been heated, get smaller, or stay the same size?" So he has the students use clickers to vote on one of those 3 alternatives. Then he has them discuss it for about just like 5 minutes. And then they vote again a second time. Turns out that more students get it right the second time than the first time, even if nobody in the group had gotten it right to begin with. Okay? And then at the end, he debriefs. So what was your intuition? Curious, what did you think? Smaller, larger, stay the same size?
If it's heated, a sheet of iron, I mean, metals expand when they heat, I believe. I'm not
Yep.
particularly specifically sure about iron specific properties because I know that there are some substances that do it differently. If I had to take a guess, I would say it would expand in some form, deform for sure, but I don't know if it would expand or contract.
So a critical hint so what happens is during the discussions, teaching assistants and the faculty member wander around and listen in and sometimes give hints. A critical hint, which I probably should have mentioned when I defined the problem, is that the heat is uniform. And the reason that's important is people have this intuition that it expands, which is correct. But a fair number of people think that each of the quadrants will expand and so push in so the hole will get smaller. But because it's been heated uniformly, the molecules right around the rim of the hole are pushing out with the same energy as everybody else. So you need additional energy to overcome that, to push them in, which you don't have. So what happens is the whole thing relaxes out. So you're right, the hole will get larger. Okay? So that's a good example of a backward loaded learning sandwich where you start with a puzzle or a problem. You then, for the act of learning, have them work on it. And then the actual content is delivered at the end. There's a reveal. So what I like to do is mix these two kinds of things. So I like it. It's a very modular approach. You have these learning objectives, specific things you want them to learn, and then you set up these learning sandwiches, which require you to really focus on, as an instructor, focus on the content that's really relevant for the learning objective, and think about the activity that's going to help the students engage with, there we are with that word again, that content, so that in fact they will really learn it. And it works. I mean, this kind of technique, what Eric Mazur does, increases retention drastically, vastly, multiples over what you get from a straight lecture.
Wow, indeed. And I think, I had read about front-end rear loaded sort of methods, but I think the example that you gave really, really makes it very clear. If I understand it correctly, it's basically teach first and assess later versus assess first or give, let's say, have an assessment of some sort first and then teach later, if I had to really use simpler terms.
Right, but you want an assessment. That's right, but you want an assessment at the end in both cases because you really want the students to know how much they've learned. So it's formative. So formative assessment is feedback to help them learn. Summative is where you're actually using it to grade them or something like that. That's how I use those terms. And I think most feedback, most assessments should be formative because the goal is to help them learn.
Absolutely. And you mentioned about also sort of making it very visible to students what the objective of whatever they're going through right now is. So more like, what are the learning goals, let's say, of this course or of the chapter,
That's right.
perhaps that in a subject in that course. And
So
often, yes,
please
please,
go on.
Stephen, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say that often the learning objectives are hierarchical. That is, there are different levels of granularity. So you have the description of a course as a whole, which basically says how the students can be transformed by taking the course. That is a kind of learning objective at the highest level. And then you can break that down. You can decompose it typically into somewhere between 3 and 6 course level learning objectives. Big, topics. They're not topics. They're learning objectives. They have verbs that introduce them so that you can later assess them. Uh, Identify, recognize, synthesize, analyze. I mean, those are all kind of verbs that introduce a learning objective. You might have 3 to 6 of those, and then each of those becomes a unit in the course. So you have a whole unit devoted to the first course level learning objective, a whole unit for the second level one, and so forth. And then within each of those, even more granular, you have a learning objectives for every single session. And you may have more than one, by the way. So depending on how challenging it is, you could have a learning objective for each of these learning sandwiches. So you could have 2 or 3 in a given session, depending on how you set it up. But the idea is you really have a clear conception as an instructor of what it is you want the students to learn, what the ideal learning outcomes ought to be, which is what you ought to assess in terms of trying to figure out whether you were successful as an instructor in teaching what you had hoped to teach.
Right. So if I had to sort of take an analogy of, let's say, atoms, right? So you have electrons, protons, neutrons coming together to form an atom. You have atoms coming together to form, let's say, a molecule. And you can have these nano learning outcomes, micro learning outcomes, and then, let's say, learning outcomes, which can eventually cluster together
Yeah.
to form course
Yeah.
outcomes.
In fact, that's the kind of vocabulary we use at Foundry, actually. Macro,
Oh, really?
Macro, micro, nano. Yeah, exactly, to describe the 3 levels. Yep.
Okay. I've heard of micro-learning outcomes and micro-learning experiences even. But yeah, I just sort of extrapolated from there and sort of put it together. Okay. Very interesting. And then I think the most important aspect, if I understood you correctly, was that these learning outcomes are, of course, important to be defined initially, but also important to be visible to the learners beyond just at the beginning of the course. Because often in many courses, that's what happens, that, okay, you start this course, this is what you will get out of it at the end of 3 months, 6 months. But 1 week in, everyone has forgotten the expected outcomes, and therefore the motivation and the engagement both perhaps can also be affected by this lack of visibility of learning outcomes, is what my understanding would be. Would you
That's right.
also say that somehow that's how it works?
Yeah, I think what you said is absolutely right. I think it's good to give them an orientation at the outset by going through the course level learning objectives. You don't want to go through the individual session level ones. It'd just be overwhelming to give it all at once. But I think it's important at the beginning of a new unit to tell them that we're now focusing on this course level learning objective, and at the beginning of every session. And one of the reasons it's important is it helps them to know what to focus on. It helps them to know what's important. So it gives them a way to separate figure from ground. And then, to the extent they understand eventually they're going to be assessed on what's important, that's another piece of motivation, external motivation. It helps them internally focus on what they're going to need to learn.
Absolutely. And you also mentioned a point about feedback among or from learners and students, if I understood that correctly. So is this feedback, let's say, between students, among students, or is it more from students towards instructors?
Right. So one of the learning principles that we use both at Acton Learning Sciences and at Foundry and Minerva is called deliberate practice, where Anders Ericsson is the person who really developed this. Um, and the idea is that you identify what's hardest for you to do and focus your attention drilling deep on that. So if you have a golf coach or something who looks at your swing, they'll figure out where you're not doing it quite right and have you focus on that. When I was learning French, I lived in France for a year and taught. I had a tutor, and when I'd say something in French, she would zero in on exactly what I was mispronouncing, which was many things. And then I'd try it again, and she'd give me more feedback. And if you learn a piano piece, you don't give equal practice to everything. When you hit the hard spots where there's syncopated 16th notes or something, you're going to practice more on that. So the challenge with deliberate practice is how to scale it, how to not just have one-to-one tutors helping you do this. So Benjamin Franklin actually came up with a way to do it. What he did is he would read a lot, and when he was teaching himself how to write well, he would identify something he thought was particularly well written. And then a couple days later, he'd try to write it down in his own words. And then he'd compare what he wrote to the original model and notice the differences. So he was able to use the model to provide the feedback, and he was able to isolate where he was having the most problems. So you can do those kinds of things at scale using peer-to-peer interactions if you provide models and rubrics where you actually tell them what the criteria are so they can evaluate each other's work and provide that kind of feedback that allows each of them to focus in on where the problems have been so they can pay more attention to that.
Right. So it's a lot. I mean, okay, I come from a data science, AI sort of an angle over here, but it's a lot how basically neural networks and the concept of AI also seems to sort of build on, right? That you have the source of truth, let's say the model, and then you have the learners trying things out and sort of comparing how they stack up against this source of truth, the model, and sort of understand the differences and then go at it again until they get closer and closer to what that model would
That
be.
is exactly right. So the go at it again part is critical. So you want to give them multiple opportunities to refine some kind of a work product that they eventually do get graded on.
Right, indeed. And I think that's also where motivation sort of comes into picture, that you don't want to demotivate the students so much that they don't go at it after the first failure, let's say. And failure doesn't necessarily have to be the end state. It could be considered as an intermediate state that can eventually lead to success.
I think that's exactly right. I think failure should be part of a process, not the end. And it's part of a process that helps you identify where you need to focus more on working on things so that at the end you're successful.
Indeed. I personally, intuitively, I'm not a learning science expert by no means, but intuitively that makes, very natural sort of sense to me. But I think a lot of education today tends to have this all or nothing sort of an approach, which can be not very helpful, even dangerous at times. Especially on student mental health, which is such a big and sensitive topic today, especially post-pandemic and now in the current situation as well.
I think
Where do you see? Sorry, Stephen, go ahead.
no, I'm sorry, I was going to take off on something you just said, which is I think it's way more important where they end up than where they start. So I'm kind of a fan of competence-based education as long as the way you define what a competence is sufficiently rigorous. So everybody can achieve the level of competence. I don't like curves in particular. I think the idea is to help them learn.
Indeed, yeah. And I think, students clearly, have a lot to benefit if this sort of almost student-centric approach is sort of applied, right? So you really understand what could be helpful to the student or the group of students, and also capture this feedback, break it down into bite-sized pieces for them, keep a goal in front of them, so even if they're straying from the goal, they still know that this is where they need to get, and therefore they're more likely to get there in the first place. And clearly, I mean, this benefits the students because they achieve these learning outcomes are more probable. It is more probable that they achieve them. What about teachers and instructors? Like, how is this beneficial to them, this sort of an approach?
It structures what you do, and we all know that structure is important, in a way that you can be more effective. That as an instructor, you have tools that will help the students get engaged and learn what it is you've defined as important, the learning objectives, so that the students are ultimately successful. And what could be more gratifying to an instructor than that?
Absolutely. And I would love to hear if there are, if there's an example or a story, let's say, of, let's say, an instructor or a group of instructors who were having trouble achieving learning outcomes or having challenges with student motivation and engagement. And then, they applied some of these techniques, and then they saw results, and, over what timeline they saw these results.
So there are many such cases published, actually, mostly in the STEM fields. One of the interesting, unexpected parts of those reports is that when you use the kind of active learning that I advocate, as do many in the STEM field, most of the current active learning techniques have actually come out of physics. People like Eric Mazur, who I mentioned earlier, and Carl Wyman, and various other people who really spearheaded this for various historical reasons. But one of the unexpected reports is that often students don't like active learning. They object to it. And I've had that same experience. I know it from my own cases. And part of the reason for that, the students claim, is that they don't think they're learning as much. So it's fascinating because their intuitions are exactly backwards. You can objectively show them that they've learned more than this other group, which has been taking a traditional course of the same materials. This has been done, it's been published, these studies. You actually learn more. But they feel like sitting there in a lecture and just writing it all down. They're learning more, but they're not. Whereas they feel like when they're doing all these exercises, debates and problem solving and all this other sort of stuff we have them do, they don't understand how much they're actually learning. So it turns out if you tell them at the beginning of a course that this is proactively preemptive strike, this is how you're going to probably feel about it, but actually you're going to, in fact, be learning more. So you may initially not feel that way, but you will. That turns out to help. It's been documented. It turns out to help. But I've just recently had exactly this experience with one of the programs that we've been developing, where the students had just textbook. And in fact, they're doing just fine. They're doing great. When you actually look at the exam scores, they're doing fantastically well. But it's learning by using. It kind of seeps in. It's not you sit down and memorize it. By another one of these learning principles is what I call the principle of deep processing. It turns out the more you pay attention and think something through, the more likely you are to remember it, even if you didn't want to. So for example, let me ask you a question. At the end of the day, as you're laying there in bed, can you think back over what happened during the day and remember the events of the day? Can you do that?
Not with a lot of accuracy necessarily, but I would say yes.
Okay, most people say yes, well over 95%. But here's the real question I want to ask. Of what you do remember from the events of the day, what percentage do you think at the time the event was occurring, you intentionally tried to memorize it so you'd be able to remember it later. So I've done this many times now with quite large groups. And I ask people to raise their hands if 50% or more of what you remember as you're laying in bed at the end of the day, at the time it happened, you intentionally tried to memorize it. No one's ever raised their hand. I then go to 25%. I've had 3. I've actually been counting this. There's at least a couple thousand, 3 out of them. I have my doubts about that. And then I start going down in increments. The modal number is somewhere between 5 and 10% people report. So in other words, at least, flip it on its ear, at least 90% by these reports of what you remember at the end of the day, you did not try to memorize at the time it was happening. Now this is anecdotal, but it's consistent with a lot of laboratory research on something called incidental learning. So a distinction between incidental learning, where you learn kind of by accident as a byproduct of processing the information, versus intentional, where you really try to do it. You might use mnemonics or various other techniques to try. The vast majority of what we learn in the course of everyday life is incidental. It's picked up by just paying attention and thinking it through. So you want to set up a situation so the learners, the students, are led to pay attention and think it through. But they may not realize, in fact they don't often, that they are in fact learning it just by doing that. It's interesting, a little paradoxical in some ways.
Indeed. And I think attention, like it's such an abstract term, right? I mean, what helps people pay attention to something and some sort of an activity, for example, like how that involves more than, let's say, just reading or listening, but perhaps combines multiple of their senses together. And, that's what helps them sort of catch or keep their attention on that activity. But
so
are there any specific things that can be, let's say, more attention catching, let's say?
Yeah, this has been studied up the wazoo since days of William James. So yeah, there are extrinsic and intrinsic factors that direct attention. So extrinsic, when something changes, your attention is going to be drawn to it. If something's very salient in the sense that it relates to one of your goals or motivations, your attention is going to be drawn to it. Extrinsically, incentives. So we can motivate you to use top down. So there's a bunch of related distinctions here. So bottom up is when stimulus properties of what's out there in the world, lead you to process it. Typically something like a change will drive bottom up processing, or again, something very salient. It's not bottoms up, by the way, it's bottom up. It's interesting. Some people can, it's like you drink bottoms up. Bottom up. Top down is where knowledge, goals, expectations, and so forth drive processing. So, and the two, of course, interact. I mean, bottom up often will trigger a cascade of top down, which then leads to more bottom up and so forth. So the two kinds of factors map nicely fairly nicely onto this idea that there are properties in the world which will capture your attention bottom up, intrinsic to what they are. And then there are factors top down that you carry with you that have to do with your motivations and expectations and goals and so on, that also direct your attention. So those two factors are working at once. And so you want to use both. You want to set up the information conveying part so it's interesting, so that you're continually grabbing it. Grabbing is bottom up, grabbing their attention by what you show them and demonstrations and things like that, or just things that are really interesting and grab their attention. But you also want to top down, use these motivational factors so that they're going to be motivated to focus, to pay attention.
Indeed, and I think the right balance is a good combination of these things that sort of are not necessarily opposite, but complementary to each other, from what I understand. Would you say competition, which often is used as perhaps an extrinsic motivator is a useful motivator in this case, as an incentive even?
I think it depends on context. I think it's a two-edged sword. Uh, if competition is within your reach, it's probably often helpful, and it may actually depend on the kind of person. There may be interactions with personality factors. I think cooperation is probably, as a general tool, better, where you have a group of students whose interests are co-aligned in producing a work product, for example, so they're motivated to help each other. I don't want to say that competition should never be used. I can imagine certain kinds of games, gamification, where students are competing, relatively low stakes, where it could lead them to pay attention and be engaged and all those other good things. But there's clearly some downsides as well.
Absolutely. I think, speaking of competition and gamification, I think often, or at least my view on it, is that gamification in itself can visualize competition, but with yourself, in the sense that you're able to gauge the progress that you're making towards a specific goal.
So I didn't think of that. It's a good point. You can compete against yourself. So if it's set up in a way that you don't lose too often, I think that really could be helpful. So that's a very good point. And I think the other point you made was also really good. You really need transparency into how well you're doing. And I think that's true just in general.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe, like, of course, on the student level, but perhaps also on the governance level of so many organizations, like which learning roles, for example, are met to what level for this entire program from this to this duration, for example. Because, like, overall, I feel that my philosophy is that, what we can observe, we can improve. And I think, all in all, that transparency and that not necessarily measurability, but just visibility can already sort of be motivating if it's not too demotivating.
I think that's exactly right, and that is a key part of deliberate practice, as I mentioned earlier. But that's not the only thing it's a key part of. But I think that's exactly right.
All right. Maybe one question that I had was, since we come from a technology background and I have a domain in experience in technology of 10 years, so most of my career, if not all of it, was in technology. So I'm really curious to understand from someone like you, how do you see the role of technology, in improving the state of education and taking it to greater heights today? Especially, I believe, the scaling aspect of things which you mentioned. Technology can play a very big part over there. But how do you see it?
So I think about three interlocking factors. Technology is one of them. The content that you're trying to teach, driven by learning objectives, another one of them. And the pedagogy, that is the teaching methods, are the third. And I think they're all interlocking. So you want technology as a tool, and you want the right tool for the content. So if you're teaching math, it's going to be different kinds of tools than if you're teaching literature, for example. And you want the right tools for the pedagogy. So the pedagogy is more general. So you want technology that will allow you to take advantage of science of learning. So I've boiled it down these 5 principles. And those 5 principles can all be exploited, usually in combination, in things like active learning. So in what activities are doing in a group. So the technology would facilitate being able to put them into groups, sometimes where you assign people based on data that you got on previous performance. So you have a group that's heterogeneous along some dimension or homogeneous along some dimension, depending on exactly what you're trying to accomplish. But the point is, the technology is a tool that's being used in the service of the pedagogy and the particular kind of content. I don't think it's something you want to consider just by itself.
Indeed. I think I also see technology as an enabler, and I think technology for the sake of technology probably is not going to change a lot of things. But if technology is used as an enabler to achieve high quality or science backed, high quality content backed by methodologies that are built with learning science, I think I believe that would be the sweet spot.
I think it's a very good way to frame it, actually. Enabler. It's a really good way to look at it.
Yeah. And I think there's also what I see right now is there is a shift, especially in the edtech space, where the technology itself is built with the context of learning science in many, many cases. And I think it really excites me to see where this can be taken in many different forms, because if you are baking in, let's say, the context of the science into the tech, and so that science can be scaled using the technology, and then it can change a lot of things, is what I see and what I believe. And really, like you said as well before we started recording the podcast, interesting times we live in these days.
Yes.
Great. Maybe one final question for the session. I could talk all day about this because this is a topic that I'm super interested in, but I know that you're probably also pressed for time. So let's keep one last question for the session. And my question was more around how big do you see the gap today between where mainstream education is and where, let's say, education backed by modern learning science can be?
That's a great question. It depends partly on institution. There's a lot of variety out there. It's not that every college and university is doing exactly the same thing. But in general, I think there's a long way to go. That is, I don't think the science of learning is being exploited anywhere near as much as it could be and should be. I think there's still a lot of traditional teaching going on where, that old joke about a lecture is where the professors conveys his or her notes to the students so they can write them down in their notes without ever having passed through either the professor's or the student's brain. So I didn't say that well, but that's unfortunately there's a lot of that still going on, which is not really promoting learning in any deep sense. But I think an unexpected consequence of the pandemic is that because so many instructors had to teach virtually and quickly learned that they couldn't just give their lecture into a camera the way they used to, that in fact there's been a fair amount of progress in exploring educational techniques that hadn't been done before, which is interesting. And I think also that we're not going to go back to just the way it was before. For most cases, some cases may, but I think there's going to be an emerging kind of hybrid approach, or approaches. There's more than one way to do hybrid, which will really has the potential to revolutionize learning. So I'm actually fairly optimistic that as an unintended consequence of this horrible thing we've all gone through in the last couple of years, that many institutions may upgrade their teaching techniques in ways that'll benefit everybody. I mean, when I say everybody, I mean not just the students. The faculty will be more effective, but also the institutions and society writ large.
Absolutely. I think the only way to look at this is holistically. Like we can't only serve one group. We need to look at how we can take all the stakeholders together, and how we can enrich education quality for everyone. And I think we also see this shift sort of happening, and I think it's only the beginning, but I feel there are institutes and organizations and just educators who are the innovators at this point, who sort of adopt these sort of technologies, and they'll be the leaders tomorrow. And the ones who are on the fence will follow, and the ones who are stuck will probably stay behind, and we know what happens when that happens.
Thank you, Dr. Darwin.
Absolutely. Great, Stephen. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and opening your mind with us today. It has been lovely. I like I said, I could just go on and on about this. This is one of my favorite topics. But maybe we can have another session with you on some more deeper topics at some point.
I would enjoy that. You've asked great questions and caused me to think about things, and I've appreciated your interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for your time. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And we will see you in the next episode of our Learning to Learn podcast by Cerebranium. See you.
So long. Thanks again.